Hi, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we are diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were misbehaving, or so Wolfe claimed at 11 that Thursday morning, which was his way of explaining why he'd come down from the plant rooms 9 minutes early and in a temper. I know Wolfe's tempers the way a sailor knows weather, and this one had nothing to do with Miltonia hybrids. It had to do with the fact that Fritz had informed him, apparently with some ceremony, that we were down to our last case of Remmers, and the distributor was having difficulties. Difficulties, Wolfe said, lowering himself into the one chair on earth built to hold him, is a word men use when they mean to disappoint you and lack the courage to say so plainly. You want me to call and lack courage back at them? He didn't answer that. He picked up his book, something German, something about beetles, always something about beetles lately, and I went back to the herbarium report I was pretending to read. And that was the state of things when the doorbell rang at 11:14. I went to the hall and did what I do, which is look through the one-way glass before opening anything. What I saw was a woman somewhere past 50, dressed with the kind of restraint that costs more than flash, standing very straight with her hands folded in front of her, like she was posing for a portrait nobody had painted yet. I opened the door. Mr. Goodwin? I'm Eleanor Voss. I telephoned an hour ago. I need to see Mr. Wolfe. I told her Mr. Wolfe was expecting nobody, and disliked surprises worse than he disliked lawyers, but that I'd ask. And I put her in the front room while I went to check, which was theater, because Wolfe had in fact taken the call himself an hour before and told me nothing about it, which was also theater, since he likes me to discover things at the door, like a man discovering weather. She's here, I said, director of the Kessler Museum, walks, like she's balancing a book on her head that isn't there anymore, which means she used to have to, and doesn't like that she still does. Wolfe grunted, which meant bring her in, so I did. She sat where clients sit, in the red leather chair, and she waited, with her hands still folded, until Wolfe looked up from his beetles, which took him 4 seconds longer than manners required, a thing he does to remind visitors whose office this is. Madam, Mr. Wolfe, 3 nights ago, a man named Julian Ash was found dead in the East Gallery of the Kessler Museum. He was our curator of European paintings. The police have called it an accident. He fell, apparently, from the mezzanine railing onto the gallery floor. I do not believe it was an accident, and I would like you to prove me right. Wolfe's eyes had gone to half their normal openness, which is as close as he comes to alertness before he's decided to be alert. Why do you disbelieve the police, madam? And why do you come to me rather than continuing to disbelieve them in private, which is cheaper? Because Julian Ash was the most careful man I have ever employed. He measured the humidity in that gallery every morning with an instrument he calibrated himself. He would no more have leaned against a railing he hadn't personally inspected than he would have hung a Vermeer with a thumbtack. And because, she said, and here her hands came apart for the first time, one of them going flat against her knee, the museum's insurers have scheduled a full inventory audit for next month, the first in 11 years, and Julian was the only person besides myself who had unsupervised access to the storage vaults at night. You suspect theft. I suspect nothing specific. I suspect everything. That is precisely the trouble, Mr. Wolfe. I have 4 senior staff members who each had reasons to want Julian gone, and I cannot go to the police with vague unease, because vague unease from a museum director 6 weeks before an insurance audit looks, to any reasonable person, like an attempt to control the narrative. I need to know what happened before that audit begins. I am prepared to pay you enough to make the question of your fee irrelevant to your decision. No fee makes a question irrelevant, madam. It merely changes its shape. He shifted, which for Wolfe is the equivalent of another man pacing the floor. You say 4 staff members had reason. Name them and the reasons, if you please, and be exact. I have small patience for delicacy. She was exact. I'll give her that. There was Priscilla Nolt, the registrar, who'd fought Ash for 8 months over a Flemish panel she believed was misattributed, and he insisted was genuine. A fight that had gotten personal enough that she'd once called him, in front of witnesses, a man who confuses stubbornness with expertise. There was Desmond Blythe, the head of conservation, who'd been passed over for the assistant directorship that went to Ash 2 years back, and hadn't stopped being sour about it since. There was Corinne Feld, a board member's niece with a curatorial fellowship nobody could quite explain, who Ash had been trying, quietly, to have removed from the program for what he called in a memo, conduct unbecoming a custodian of the collection, whatever that meant. And there was Marcus Kepler, the museum's chief financial officer, who controlled acquisitions budgets that Ash had, in the last year, begun questioning with what Voss called unusual persistence. Wolfe listened to all of it with his eyes shut, which people who don't know him take for sleep, and which I've learned to read as the opposite. When she finished, he opened his eyes and said, "You've given me 4 people and 4 grievances, madam, each sufficient to justify a slammed door, but none, on its face, sufficient to justify a body on a gallery floor. Grudges are common as dust. Murder is not. What haven't you told me?" It was a flat question, no charge behind it. But I saw something move across her face. Not guilt exactly, more like a woman recalculating how much of the truth the arithmetic actually required. "There was a 5th key," she said finally, "to the storage vault. Julian had one, I have one. The security office holds one in a locked box that requires 2 signatures to open. That's 3. But when the police inventoried his office, they found a note in his desk calendar. 2 words, written the morning he died. It said, 5th key. I don't know what it means. I don't know that it means anything. I only know that nobody else was supposed to have one, and I have been unable to stop thinking about it since I read it." Wolfe sat with that a moment, and I watched something settle into place behind his eyes. The particular stillness he gets when a case has just stopped being a favor and started being a problem worth his attention. "Archie," he said, "get the notebook. Madam, you will now tell me everything you know about Mr. Ash's final week, in order, and you will not summarize." I got the notebook. Outside, somewhere below 35th Street, the ordinary city went on being ordinary, and I had the feeling, not for the first time, that we were about to make it considerably less so. Wolfe took the case, which surprised nobody less than Eleanor Voss, who'd clearly come prepared to argue and found she didn't need to. The fee he named would have made a Wall Street lawyer wince, and she wrote the check without so much as a blink, which told me more about her bank account than her testimony had told us about her museum. "I will need to see them," Wolfe said, once the check was in the drawer where such things go. "All 4. Here, not at your museum, where they will be surrounded by the comfort of familiar walls and colleagues to perform for. Arrange it for tomorrow. I would suggest you not tell them why, beyond that a matter concerning Mr. Ash requires their attention." She agreed, gathered her composure back around her like a coat, and left. I showed her out, and came back to find Wolfe already ringing for beer, which meant the interview was over as far as his stomach was concerned, whatever remained unfinished in his head. 4 suspects, I said, and a note that says 5th key. You want me to run down what I can on them before tomorrow, or do you like being surprised? I dislike being surprised extremely. Go. So I went, and by 6 that evening I'd put together enough on Priscilla Nolt, Desmond Blythe, Corinne Feld, and Marcus Kepler to fill a slim dossier, which I typed up and left on Wolfe's desk before dinner, because he reads better on a full stomach, and worse on an empty argument. The short version: Nolt was 44, a registrar with a reputation for being right more often than she was liked, which is a hard way to make friends in an institution built on consensus. Blythe was 51, 22 years at the museum, and had the kind of resume that should have gotten him the assistant directorship on paper and somehow hadn't. Feld was 29, well-dressed on a fellowship stipend that didn't explain it, and her uncle sat on the museum's board, and had, according to one gallery assistant I bought a drink for, basically installed her. Kepler was 56, CFO for 9 years, married to money of his own, which made his interest in acquisition budgets either principle or habit, and I hadn't decided which. They came the next afternoon, one at a time, at intervals Wolfe had specified through Voss, with the precision of a man scheduling surgeries. I sat at my desk, with the notebook, and did what I do, which is watch the parts of people that talk louder than their mouths. Priscilla Nolt came first, at 2:15, sharp as her appointment. She was a compact woman, with gray threaded early into dark hair, and she sat in the red chair like she'd measured it for accuracy and found it slightly off. She answered Wolfe's opening questions, her position, her tenure, her relationship with Ash, in short, complete sentences. The way a woman answers who has learned that unnecessary words get used against you in meetings. You disputed his attribution of a Flemish panel, Wolfe said. Tell me about it. He was wrong, she said. I told him he was wrong. I have a doctorate in Netherlandish painting, and access to provenance documentation he'd apparently never bothered reading closely. And he decided my correction was insubordination rather than scholarship. That's the museum in a sentence, Mr. Wolfe. Men with confidence outrank women with citations. You quarreled publicly with him. I said one true sentence to him in front of 2 colleagues, and he never forgave me for it being witnessed. If that's a quarrel, half the art world is at war. She hadn't moved in her chair since sitting down, hands still, voice level, and it was the stillness that interested me, because in my experience, genuinely calm people fidget a little. It's only the ones working hard to seem calm who go completely motionless, like they've frozen a held breath into a posture. Where were you the night he died? At home. Alone. Reading a condition report I'd brought back from the museum, which I'm sure sounds convenient and isn't disprovable, which I'm also sure you've already noted. I had, Wolfe said, and something in his tone might, in a lesser man, have been called approval. She left at 2:40, and Desmond Blythe came in 5 minutes later, a big soft man with the kind of beard that's trying to apologize for a receding hairline. And he sat down before Wolfe invited him to, which Wolfe noted with a flicker I caught, and Blythe didn't. Blythe talked more than Nault had, which is usually a worse sign, not a better one. He talked about his 22 years at the museum, about the assistant directorship that should have gone to institutional knowledge, not to a man who'd been there 4 years and knew how to charm a search committee, about how Ash had systematized the conservation lab in ways Blythe clearly considered a personal insult disguised as modernization. You resented him, Wolfe said, flat. I disagreed with him. You resented him. Resentment and disagreement wear different clothes, sir, and yours is dressed for resentment. Where were you the night he died? Blythe's hands, which had been doing a great deal of gesturing, went still on his knees, and I marked it, because a man who's been talking with his hands for 20 minutes and suddenly stops is a man who's just realized his hands were saying something he'd rather they hadn't. At a dinner, with my wife, until 11, and after 11, home, asleep. Your wife will confirm both halves equally? A pause, half a second, no more. Yes. Wolfe let it sit there a moment, the way he does when he wants a silence to do work a question wouldn't, and then moved on to something else entirely. The storage vault. Who had keys, whether Blythe had ever had reason to be there at night, and got nothing but denials, delivered a shade too quickly. Blythe left at 3:05, looking like a man who'd sweated through an undershirt he was glad his jacket covered. Corinne Feld came next, and she was a different animal altogether. Young, poised in the specific way that money teaches rather than confidence earns, and she answered Wolfe's questions about her fellowship and her uncle's board seat with a smile so practiced it had probably never once reached her eyes. Mr. Ash wanted you removed from the program, Wolfe said. Conduct unbecoming a custodian of the collection. What conduct, madam? I have no idea. Julian was territorial. He didn't like fellows who asked questions about acquisition history he considered above their pay grade. You asked such questions? I asked several. It's what a fellowship is for. About which acquisitions? The smile didn't move, but something behind it did, a fraction of a second late, like an actor catching a line she'd almost missed. General ones. Provenance mostly. It's a genuine interest of mine. Wolfe let that sentence hang exactly long enough to make its emptiness audible, then asked where she'd been the night Ash died. A gallery opening downtown, dozens of witnesses, a story so solid I could practically hear the concrete setting, and moved on. But I wrote 3 words in my notebook under her name, asked which acquisitions, and underlined them, because Wolfe hadn't pushed and I wondered why not. Marcus Kepler came last, at 4, a trim silver-haired man in a suit that fit like it had opinions. And he was the only one of the 4 who seemed genuinely, uncomplicatedly sorry that Ash was dead, which made him either the most honest of them or the best actor. He answered questions about the acquisitions budget with the smooth patience of a man reciting figures he'd recited to boards for years. And when Wolfe asked directly whether Ash's unusual persistence about those budgets had concerned specific transactions, Kepler said, "Julian questioned everything eventually. It's what made him good at his job." I never took it personally. In a voice so reasonable, it was almost the least convincing answer of the afternoon. He left at 4:20. Wolfe sat with his eyes shut for a full minute after the door closed, and I waited him out, because interrupting Wolfe's silences is like interrupting a man doing arithmetic in his head. You just get the wrong number faster. "Archie," he said finally, 4 people, and 3 of them lied to me in some particular, and none of the 3 lies match each other, which is either bad luck or very good management. Miss Feld knows something about a specific acquisition, and would rather I not ask which. Mr. Blythe's wife will discover if we ask her that 11 o'clock is generous, and Mr. Kepler is too calm by exactly the amount that worries me. And Nolt? Miss Nolt told the truth about everything except how she felt about it, which is not a crime, merely a habit of proud women. He opened his eyes. "Get your notebook. Tomorrow you go to the museum and find out what acquisition made Julian Ash persistent enough to be called it by his own financial officer, and what Corinne Feld's questions actually concerned. I suspect the 5th key and the 5th story are the same object wearing 2 names." The Kessler Museum sat on a quiet stretch just off 5th in the 70s, the kind of building that had been somebody's mansion once, and now wore its conversion to public institution the way an old society woman wears a cardigan over an evening gown. Politely, but you could still see what it used to be. I got there at 10, flashed the letter Voss had given me, identifying me as conducting inquiries on the museum's behalf, and was handed off to a security supervisor named Ruiz, who'd clearly been told to cooperate, and clearly didn't love it. "You want to see where it happened," he said. "Not a question. For a start." The East Gallery was a long room 2 stories tall, hung with paintings I didn't recognize, and lit by skylights that made the whole place feel like church, minus the singing. A mezzanine ran along one side, reachable by a narrow staircase at the far end, and up there was where Julian Ash had gone over the railing 3 nights before, landing on a parquet floor that Ruiz informed me, with a wince, "We haven't been able to fully clean the finish off, actually." I went up. The railing was iron, waist-high on me, which meant it would have hit a grown man somewhere around the hip, low enough to go over if you leaned wrong, high enough that going over by accident took either bad luck or a shove. "Was he a big man?" I asked. "Ash?" 5'9" maybe, slight build. "And careful, that's the word everyone keeps using." "Careful like you wouldn't believe," Ruiz said, and something in his voice had actual feeling in it, which was the first honest thing anybody at that museum had shown me. He used to yell at me if the humidity logs were off by 2%. Man measured his own coffee with a scale, I heard, so it'd be the same every morning. Guy like that doesn't lean on a railing he hasn't checked. I told the detectives that. They wrote it down and told me accidents happen to careful people, same as anybody. They're not wrong, generally. No, Ruiz agreed, but generally isn't Julian Ash. I asked him about the storage vault next, and that's where things got more interesting than a railing. The vault was 2 floors down, a climate-controlled room behind a door that needed both a keycard and a physical key, the kind of double-lock arrangement museums use so no single person can waltz in alone with a hand truck. 3 keys existed by the official count: Ash's, Voss's, and the one in the security office box that needed 2 signatures. You ever hear talk of a 4th key, or a 5th? Ruiz's face did something careful, the particular carefulness of a man deciding how much his paycheck is worth. There's stories, old stories, from before my time here, 6-7 years back, about a key that went missing during a renovation. Nobody ever found it. Official position is it got thrown out with construction debris. And the unofficial position? Unofficial position is I don't get paid enough to have one. I let that go, and asked instead about the acquisition records, because Wolfe had sent me here to find out what Ash had gotten unusually persistent about. And security guards generally don't know financial minutia, but they do know who visits whom and when. Ruiz, warming slightly now that I wasn't pushing the key question, told me that in his final month, Ash had spent a lot of after-hours time in the registrar's office, going through old acquisition files with Priscilla Nolt, which didn't match the story of open warfare Nolt had given us, and that Corinne Feld had been down in those same records more than once in the weeks before Ash died, alone, after the department had officially closed for the evening, using her fellow's card to badge in. That was 2 contradictions in one conversation, and I hadn't even gotten to the registrar's office yet. Priscilla Nolt wasn't happy to see me, but she let me in, and when I mentioned, carefully, the way Wolfe would want it mentioned, like I already half knew the answer, that Ash had spent time with her going through old files in his last weeks, her face did something that wasn't quite surprise, and wasn't quite relief, more like the look of someone who'd been holding a secret so long, they'd forgotten it would eventually have to come out through a door, instead of just sitting in the room with them. He came to me, she said, 3 weeks before he died. He apologized, actually, for the Flemish panel business, said he'd looked at my provenance documents again and thought I might be right after all, and that he needed my help with something more important. He'd found a discrepancy in the acquisition records for a painting purchased 8 years ago, before either of our times, mind you, a Dutch interior, minor artist, purchased through a European dealer for a price that didn't match the insurance valuation filed 2 years later. The valuation was nearly triple the purchase price. That happens, doesn't it? Art appreciates. Not that fast, not for that artist, and not without a single comparable sale anywhere to justify it. Julian thought someone had falsified the original purchase documentation, recorded a lower price than was actually paid, which would mean money went somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, or recorded a fraudulent later valuation to justify something else entirely. He was trying to find out, before he took it to Eleanor, who approved the original purchase. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether I already knew the answer, and just wanted to hear her say it. Marcus Kepler countersigned it. 8 years ago, before he was CFO. He was assistant to the previous financial officer then. And the valuation 2 years later, the tripled one? That was submitted by a fellowship researcher doing insurance appraisal work as part of her practicum. Feld. Corinne Feld, Nolt confirmed. Though I should say, in fairness, she'd have been perhaps 21 at the time, working under supervision. It's entirely possible she simply filed what she was told to file. I thanked her, went and found Corinne Feld in a curatorial office 2 floors up. And this time, I didn't lead carefully. I just told her plainly that I knew about the Dutch interior and the valuation discrepancy, and asked her straight out what she'd been doing in the storage records at night, alone, in the weeks before Ash died. The composure held for about 4 seconds, which was longer than I expected and shorter than she wanted. I was trying to fix it, she said, and her voice had lost the practiced polish entirely, gone thin and young underneath. I filed that valuation 8 years ago because I was told to file it, by someone who had authority over my practicum grade and my recommendation letters. And I didn't understand what I was signing until years later, when I actually knew enough about the field to understand the number was insane. When Julian started asking questions, I panicked. I went through the records at night, trying to find some way to quietly correct the file before anyone traced it back to me, because I was terrified I'd be blamed for a fraud I didn't design and barely understood at the time. "Who told you to file it?" She looked at the door like it might rescue her, then back at me. "I don't have proof. I only have what I remember, and memory 8 years old isn't proof of anything, Mr. Goodwin, is it?" I told her Wolfe would want to hear it anyway, proof or no proof, and left her sitting there with her hands finally, visibly, not still at all. I called the brownstone from a drugstore phone 2 blocks away, and got Wolfe on the line, gave him the short version, the missing key, the falsified valuation, Kepler's signature 8 years back, Feld's coerced fraud, Ash's quiet investigation, with Nolt as an unlikely ally. There was a silence on the line, the kind Wolfe uses to arrange facts into furniture. "The 5th key," he said finally, "was never lost in a renovation, Archie. It was kept. And Mr. Ash, being a careful man, would have wanted to see for himself what that vault actually contained before he took a fraud 8 years old to Mrs. Voss with only paper to support it. Come home. I believe we now know why he went to the mezzanine that night, and I begin to suspect it wasn't to inspect a railing at all." I got back to the brownstone a little past 2, and Wolfe was at his desk with the beer tray in front of him, and an expression that meant he'd been thinking hard enough to have skipped a page of his book without noticing. I gave him the whole account again, slower this time, with Fritz bringing lunch halfway through. Shad roe, as it happened, which Wolfe ate with the particular ceremony he reserves for anything involving fish and spring. And by the time I finished, he'd stopped eating altogether, which for Wolfe is roughly equivalent to another man standing up and pacing. "The key," he said, "is the hinge on which this whole business turns, and we don't have it. Everything else is architecture, built on a foundation we haven't seen. I want Kepler and Miss Feld here together this afternoon, and I want Mrs. Voss present as well, because I intend to ask her a question I should have asked 3 days ago." "Together? You never do suspects together. You always said putting 2 liars in a room lets them coordinate. It also lets them contradict each other, which at this stage is more valuable than protecting them from collusion they've had a week to arrange already." He rang for Fritz to clear the lunch things. "Call Mrs. Voss. Tell her 4 o'clock and tell her to bring Mr. Kepler and Miss Feld, and tell her nothing else." They arrived within a few minutes of one another, which meant Voss had marshaled them like a woman used to being obeyed, and I got them seated, Kepler and Feld in the yellow chairs, Voss in the red one, which left Kepler looking faintly insulted at not getting the good seat. A small thing, but the kind of small thing I notice. Wolfe didn't waste time. 8 years ago, a Dutch interior painting was purchased by this museum through a European dealer, and the purchase price entered into your records did not match a valuation filed 2 years later by Miss Feld, then a practicum researcher. "Mr. Kepler, you countersigned the original purchase. Explain the discrepancy." Kepler's composure, which had survived a full interview the day before without a crack, went first at the eyes. A flicker, gone almost before I caught it, and then his voice came out level and reasonable, the same tone he'd used before. "I countersigned dozens of purchases that year as an assistant financial officer. I don't recall the specifics of every acquisition 8 years back, Mr. Wolfe, and I resent the implication that a signature from that long ago constitutes—" "I have implied nothing yet," Wolfe said. "I have stated a fact, and asked for an explanation of it. Your resentment is premature, and I think performed. Miss Feld, you filed the later valuation. Tell Mr. Kepler what you told Mr. Goodwin this morning." Feld's hands were in her lap, and she looked at Voss before she looked at Kepler, a look that asked forgiveness in advance. "I filed a valuation nearly 3 times the recorded purchase price, because I was told to file it. I was 21, doing supervised appraisal work, and the person supervising me told me the number and told me to enter it, and I trusted that because I didn't yet know enough to question it. "Who supervised you?" Wolfe asked, though I suspected he already knew the shape of the answer he wanted spoken aloud, in this room, in front of the man it concerned. She said it quietly, but the room was quiet enough that quietly was plenty. "Marcus." Kepler stood up. It was the first genuinely unplanned thing I'd seen him do in 2 meetings, and it told me more than his careful answers had. She's 29 years old, attaching a decade-old memory to a signature that could belong to any of 6 people who had countersigning authority that year. I won't sit here and be accused by a fellow with a grudge over a curatorial position she barely deserves, and the word of a man who's dead and can't confirm anything. "Sit down, sir," Wolfe said, not loudly, but with the particular flatness that has made larger men than Kepler sit down before now. And he did. "Nobody has accused you of anything but a signature, which you've admitted you cannot specifically deny. Miss Feld has accused you of instruction, which is a different matter, and one I'm inclined to believe, because it requires no motive on her part to invent. She incriminates herself equally in the telling. What would serve her better, Mr. Kepler, silence or confession?" Kepler didn't answer that, which was itself an answer. Wolfe turned to Voss, who had sat through all of it with her hands folded, exactly as they'd been in this office 3 days before, controlled in a way that was starting to look less like composure and more like practice. "Madam, you told me on your first visit that only 3 keys to the storage vault existed, and that a note in Mr. Ash's calendar referencing a 5th had troubled you deeply. I put it to you now that this is not entirely accurate. A 4th key was reported lost during a renovation some 6 or 7 years ago. Coincidentally, or not, in roughly the same period as the acquisition we're discussing. Did you know of this missing key before Mr. Ash's death?" And there it was, the crack I'd been waiting 3 days to see, because Eleanor Voss's hands came apart, both of them this time, and pressed flat against her knees, in a gesture I recognized from Blythe, the exact motion of someone whose hands had finally stopped agreeing to lie for them. "Yes," she said. "I knew. I've known for years. When the key went missing during the renovation, I made the decision not to report it formally, because a formal report would have triggered a full security review and an external audit at a time when the museum was already under financial strain from a capital campaign that hadn't met its targets. I told myself it was prudence. I've had 6 years to reconsider whether it was cowardice instead. And when Mr. Ash's calendar note surfaced, 5th key, you understood immediately what it meant, and you came to me anyway, without volunteering that understanding. I came to you because I didn't know what he'd found, only that he'd found something, and I was afraid of what it would mean for the museum if it came out badly, and I thought—" She stopped, and for the first time since I'd met her, Eleanor Voss looked genuinely uncertain of her own reasoning. "I thought if you found it first, in your own way, I could still control how it was handled." "You wish to hire the truth on a leash," Wolfe said, "which is a common ambition and a rare success. Madam, a missing key, a falsified valuation, and a careful man asking questions about both do not by themselves produce a body on a gallery floor. Someone made a decision that Julian Ash's questions were dangerous enough to end it. I don't yet know which of you made it, though I have a working suspicion, and I intend to have certainty before this week is finished." He looked at Kepler, whose face had gone the pale, damp color of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. "Mr. Kepler, where precisely were you the night Mr. Ash died? And I would remind you that Mr. Goodwin is quite skilled at discovering when precisely has been used loosely." Kepler's mouth opened, and what came out wasn't the smooth museum fundraiser voice from before. It was thinner, and it cracked once in the middle of the first sentence. "I was at the museum," he said, "until nearly 10. I can explain why. I want to explain why. But I think I need a lawyer before I explain anything else." Wolfe sat back and something in his face settled, the particular satisfaction of a man who has just watched a wall crack in exactly the place he'd been leaning on it. "That," he said, "is the most honest sentence you've spoken in this office, sir. Archie, show Mr. Kepler to the door. He'll return, I think, once he's had time to consider that silence, at this point, protects him considerably less than he imagines." Kepler left with a lawyer's name half-formed on his lips, and Feld trailing after Voss, looking like a woman who'd just watched her own confession do something she hadn't quite intended, which is to say, land harder on someone else than on herself. That left Wolfe and me, and a house gone quiet. And Wolfe sat with his eyes shut for a good 5 minutes before he opened them, and said, "Kepler was at the museum until 10. Ash died sometime after 11, according to the medical examiner's estimate Mrs. Voss provided. There is an hour unaccounted for, and I want to know what happened in it, and whether anyone else was in that building. Start with whoever locks up." That sent me back uptown a little after 5, into a fine mist that was working itself up to a proper rain, and I found the museum's night security log in the hands of a different guard than Ruiz, a heavy-set fellow named Petrosian, who'd worked the overnight shift for 11 years, and clearly regarded the logbook as something between a Bible and a grudge he was keeping against the world. "Everybody signs out," he told me, tapping the book like it might argue with him. "No exceptions, no matter how important they think they are. I've had board members try to walk past me without signing. Doesn't happen twice." The log for the night in question showed Kepler out at 9:52, which matched what he'd said, sweat and all. It also showed something nobody had mentioned to us yet. Desmond Blythe in at 9:15, out at 10:40. "Blythe," I said, "the conservation head. He have a habit of coming in at night?" "Time to time. Conservators keep funny hours. Humidity checks, treatments that can't be interrupted, that kind of business. Nothing strange about it by itself." "Was it strange that night?" Petrosian thought about it, or performed thinking about it, which are sometimes the same thing, and sometimes very much not. He seemed in a hurry going out. Didn't stop to chat, which he usually does. Man likes to talk, that one. Just signed and went. I asked about Ash himself, and got the answer I expected and one I didn't. Ash had signed in at 8:30, which was normal for him, but he hadn't signed out at all, which the police report had already noted, obviously, since his body was found the next morning still inside. What I hadn't expected was Petrosian mentioning, almost as an afterthought, while flipping the page back to check a date, that the East Gallery's motion-triggered security lighting had a Certus log too, and that lighting log showed movement on the mezzanine at 10:52 p.m., 2 minutes after Blythe had signed out downstairs. That didn't square. If Blythe had left the building at 10:40, he couldn't have triggered a motion light on the mezzanine at 10:52 unless the sign-out log was wrong, back in without signing, or somebody else entirely had been up there. I called the brownstone, got Wolfe on the line, and gave him the discrepancy. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear Fritz banging a pot in the kitchen behind him. "Ask Petrosian," Wolfe said, "whether the motion sensor and the door log are on the same clock, synchronized to the same source, or whether they're independent systems that might simply disagree by some minutes." I asked. Petrosian, to his credit, actually knew the answer. The door log ran off the security desk's own clock, reset monthly by hand. The gallery motion sensors ran off a separate maintenance system tied to the building's climate controls, synced automatically to a national time signal. Which meant, when I did the arithmetic Wolfe would want done, that the motion sensor's clock was almost certainly the more reliable one, and the door log's 10:40 for Blythe's exit could easily have drifted a few minutes off true time without anyone noticing or caring, because nobody had ever needed it to be accurate to the minute before. I reported that back, and Wolfe made a small sound that in another man would have been satisfaction. Then it is entirely possible Mr. Blythe was still in that gallery at 10:52, or had only just left it, close enough in time to make no material difference. Go to his home, Archie. I want his wife's account of when he arrived that evening, obtained without his presence to shape it. Blythe lived in a comfortable co-op on the west side, and his wife, A thin, tired-looking woman named Iris opened the door herself and didn't seem especially surprised to find a stranger asking about her husband's whereabouts 3 nights back. Which told me something before she said a word. He said the museum. Working late on a treatment that couldn't be interrupted. Something about a varnish layer, humidity sensitive, needing to be monitored through a curing period. He's said that before plenty of times, and it's usually true. I had no reason to doubt it that night either, until the newspaper said Julian Ash had died there, while he was supposedly monitoring varnish 2 floors away. Did he seem different that night when he came in, compared to other late nights? She thought about it with the particular honesty of a woman who's stopped protecting a marriage that's already given her enough reasons not to. He was pale. He poured himself a whiskey, which he doesn't usually do on a work night, and he didn't want to talk, which he also doesn't usually do. Desmond always wants to talk. It's practically his defining feature. I asked if something was wrong, and he said he was just tired. I didn't push. I should have pushed. I thanked her, and on my way out she added one more thing, offered without my asking, the way people sometimes do when a stranger's presence has finally given them permission to say something they've been carrying alone. He's been different since. Quieter. He gets up at night and stands in the kitchen. I don't know what that means, but I thought someone should know it. I called it in from a corner phone booth, with the rain coming down properly now. Gave Wolfe the whole of it. The drifted door log. The mezzanine motion sensor at 10:52. Blythe's true arrival home past midnight instead of 11. The whiskey. The pallor. The kitchen at night. So Blythe was in that gallery, or near it, close to the time Ash died, I said. And he's been lying about when he got home ever since. And his own wife just handed us the rope. Wolfe was quiet on the line a moment. It places him there, Archie, which is considerable. But placement is not proof of the hand that did the pushing. And I remind you, Kepler was in the building until nearly 10 with a motive of his own, 8 years deep. And Miss Feld's fear runs plenty deep enough to have driven someone less composed than she appears to something desperate. We have 3 people now with reason to fear what Ash had found, and only one railing. Come home. I believe tomorrow I will need to see Mr. Blythe again. And this time I do not intend to let him leave this office with a story that doesn't survive its own arithmetic. I got back to the brownstone with my coat soaked through and my notebook damp at the edges, and found Wolfe not at his desk, but standing, actually standing, which for Wolfe after 7 in the evening is a kind of minor weather event, in front of the big globe he keeps in the corner, and never once, in my memory, consults for navigation. He wasn't looking at it. He was looking at nothing, which is how he looks when he's looking at everything at once. Sit, he said, without turning. Dry yourself first if you must, but sit, because I want to talk this through aloud, and I want your objections where you have them. That was unusual enough that I got the notebook out fast. Wolfe talking a case through out loud, before he's certain, is a rarer bird than the case itself most weeks. We have 3 people in that building, within striking distance of the hour Ash died, Wolfe said, lowering himself finally into his chair, which took its usual complaint of a creak. Kepler, out at 9:52 by the log, plausible motive 8 years old and freshly reopened. Blythe, in the gallery or near it past 11, home past midnight, lying about the hour ever since, motive professional and personal both, the assistant directorship, the systematized lab he resented. And Feld, whose alibi at a downtown opening is, you tell me, solid as concrete, dozens of witnesses, which removes her physically from the building, but not necessarily from the chain of events, since fear is a motive that can operate at a distance, through another hand. You think she put someone up to it? I think it premature to assume anyone was put up to anything, Archie, and I dislike the phrase for the same reason I dislike most shortcuts. It assumes conspiracy, where simpler explanations often suffice. Let us instead ask what Julian Ash actually did that night, since we've spent considerable effort on where everyone else was, and very little on where he went, and why. He shut his eyes. He signed in at 8:30. He was found the next morning on the gallery floor, beneath the mezzanine railing. Between those 2 facts lies everything we need. And I think we have been looking at the wrong end of it. Meaning? Meaning we have asked, who killed him, when we ought first to have settled, why the mezzanine? A careful man, Mrs. Voss called him, a man who measured his own coffee. Such a man does not lean idly on a railing at 11 at night for no reason. He goes to a specific place for a specific purpose. What is on that mezzanine, Archie, besides a railing and a view of the gallery floor? I hadn't actually looked. I'd gone up, noted the height of the rail, come back down, and moved on to the vault, which in hindsight was exactly the kind of thing Wolfe complains about when he says I see rooms instead of buildings. I don't know. Paintings, presumably. It's a gallery. Find out precisely what hangs there, and more particularly, find out whether the mezzanine has any access, stairs, a service door, anything, to the vault levels below, or to any storage area that doesn't run through the main gallery floor where Petrosian or his colleagues would have logged it. I saw where he was going, or thought I did. You think Ash went up there to get to the vault a back way, not to look at a railing, to get somewhere the front way wouldn't let him get quietly? I think it worth investigating before I think anything further, Wolfe said, which was as close as he comes to admitting a hunch. A man convinced there was a fraud in his museum's records, and a fifth key rumored lost 7 years back. If that key still existed, and if it opened something other than the vault's main door, our careful Mr. Ash strikes me as exactly the sort who would want to see with his own eyes before accusing anyone of anything on paper alone. He would have chosen a route that avoided Petrosian's log, avoided being seen going into the vault at an hour that would require explanation. The mezzanine, if it connects to anything below, would serve that purpose admirably. I called Ruiz first thing the next morning, before he'd even properly started his shift, and the answer when it came made me feel like an idiot for not asking 3 days earlier. There was a service stair off the mezzanine, unmarked, used by lighting technicians to access the gallery's upper fixtures, and it ran down, not to the main floor, but to a maintenance corridor that connected, via a locked door, directly to the storage vault's rear entrance. A second door into the vault that existed for moving large crates without parading them through public galleries, and that required only a single key, no key card, no double signature, because it was meant for supervised staff use and had never been considered a security risk worth the same protocol as the front. The missing key, I said, when I got Wolfe on the phone. It wasn't for the front door at all, it was for the back one, the maintenance entrance. Which explains a great deal, Wolfe said, including why its loss was never treated with the alarm a front door key would have provoked. A rear service key, misplaced during a renovation, sounds like clutter, not catastrophe. Whoever kept that key rather than reporting it lost, possessed for 7 years, away into that vault that left no record at the front desk whatsoever. Come home, Archie, and bring Ruiz's full staff roster from that renovation period, if he'll part with it. I want to know precisely who worked on that mezzanine stairwell, and who had access to it during the weeks the key went missing, because I no longer believe it was misplaced by accident at all. I got the roster, a short list, as it turned out, since the renovation contractor had used a small in-house museum crew rather than an outside firm for the sensitive upper gallery work, on Voss's own cost-cutting instruction from that same lean fundraising year. Petrosian's own, an electrician long since retired to Florida. 2 junior conservation staff who'd since left the museum entirely, and 2 names that stopped me cold enough that I read them twice before calling it in. Desmond Blythe had supervised that crew as head of conservation, and Marcus Kepler, then an assistant financial officer with no earthly reason to be anywhere near a stairwell renovation, had signed off on the project's final budget reconciliation 2 weeks after the key was reported missing. A reconciliation that, buried in a line item, Voss's records showed but nobody had apparently ever questioned, included a curious $400 charge for hardware replacement mezzanine access that nobody had followed up with an actual receipt. I brought it all home, Laid it out for Wolfe over a dinner of lamb kidneys that I barely tasted, I was so busy talking. And Wolfe listened through the whole meal without interrupting, which was its own kind of compliment. When Fritz had cleared the plates and brought coffee, Wolfe sat back with the particular stillness he gets when the last piece of a puzzle has clicked somewhere behind his eyes, even if his mouth hasn't caught up yet. "Two men," he said, "each with a reason to want that back door quietly available. Each with a reason, 7 years apart, to fear what would happen if the fraud beneath it ever surfaced. I begin to believe, Archie, that this was never a case of one man killing to protect one secret, but of two men who had, without ever quite saying so to each other, come to depend on the same silence for entirely different reasons. That is a fragile arrangement. Fragile arrangements, when threatened, do not always break along the lines you'd expect." He set down his cup. "Tomorrow I want Blythe back in that chair, alone, and I intend this time to tell him precisely what we know about that stairwell, before I ask him a single question about the night Ash died. A man confronted with architecture he thought secret behaves very differently than a man merely asked where he was at 11 o'clock. We shall see which kind of man Desmond Blythe actually is." Desmond Blythe came in at 11 the next morning, looking like a man who hadn't slept properly since I'd left his wife standing in her own doorway 2 nights before, which, given what Iris Blythe had told me about kitchens at night, was probably close to the literal truth. He sat down in the yellow chair this time, not the red one, I noticed, as though some instinct had told him he'd forfeited the privilege of the good seat. And Wolfe let him sit in silence for a good 30 seconds before speaking, which is a technique I've watched work on harder men than Blythe. "Mr. Blythe," Wolfe said finally, "I know about the service stairwell from the East Gallery mezzanine to the maintenance corridor. I know it connects to a rear entrance to the storage vault that requires only a single key, no key card, no witness signature. I know you supervised the renovation crew that built that stairwell 7 years ago, during which time a key to that rear vault door was reported lost and never recovered. I know Marcus Kepler signed a budget reconciliation 2 weeks after that loss, containing an unexplained $400 charge for hardware replacement. I put it to you plainly, sir, so that you understand there is no longer any profit in denying the architecture of this matter. Whatever you choose to say about the night itself." Blythe's face did something I hadn't seen from him before. Not the sweat and evasion of our first meeting, but something closer to relief. The specific relief of a man who's been carrying a weight alone and has just been told he doesn't have to explain where the weight came from anymore, only what he did with it. "I didn't kill him," he said. "I want that said first, plainly, before anything else, because I know how this looks, and I know I've made it look worse by lying about the time I got home. And I want you to hear the rest with that already stated." "Say the rest then, and let it earn its own belief." Blythe's hands, which had been still in his lap, came up finally, rubbing once against his knees like he was warming them. 7 years ago, during the renovation, I kept that key. I'm not going to dress it up. I took it, deliberately, and told the security office it must have been lost during construction. Because I'd discovered something in the vault I wasn't supposed to see, doing a condition survey of pieces slated for the mezzanine hang. And I wanted a way back in that didn't require Eleanor's permission or a witness signature every time. What had you discovered? A painting that shouldn't have been there. Or rather, a painting that was there, catalogued as one thing, that I was fairly certain, from my own conservation background, was something else entirely. Not a fraud in the acquisition sense Julian was chasing. Older than that. A piece I believed had been misattributed for decades, possibly deliberately by someone long since retired or dead, and that if correctly identified, would be worth perhaps 8 times its insured value. I told myself I kept the key to study it properly, off the books, before deciding whether to raise the question formally. That's true, as far as it goes. It's also a convenient story, and I've had 7 years to polish it. And Kepler's hardware charge? He caught me. Not deliberately. He was reconciling the renovation budget and noticed the missing key hadn't been replaced through normal channels, which would have shown up as a supply requisition, and instead, there was nothing, just a gap. He came to me quietly, and I told him the truth, more or less, and he made a decision I've never fully understood the reasoning for. He buried it, filed a phantom hardware charge to make the books balance, and never mentioned it again. I always assumed he did it because raising it would have meant an internal investigation during a year the museum could not afford bad press of any kind, with the capital campaign already limping. I never asked him to explain further, and he never offered. Wolfe's eyes had gone to their most closed, which meant his mind was working fastest. So for 7 years, two men shared a silence neither had discussed openly with the other, each protecting a different secret behind the same locked door. And then Julian Ashe began asking questions about an entirely separate matter, the falsified valuation, that happened to route him toward the very vault your hidden key opened. Yes, Blythe said, and here his voice thinned considerably. That's exactly what happened, and it's the part I haven't told anyone, including my wife. 3 weeks before he died, Julian came to me, not accusing, asking. He'd noticed going through old records with Priscilla that a mezzanine renovation 7 years back coincided suspiciously with some irregularity in vault access logs, and he wanted my professional opinion, as head of conservation, on whether the Surthus stairwell could physically connect down to storage. I told him no. I lied to his face, badly I think, because he looked at me the way you're looking at me now, and I knew he didn't believe me. Did he confront you again? Once more, 4 days before he died. He told me he intended to check the stairwell himself, physically, that week, because paper records weren't settling the question, and he didn't trust anyone's account of it secondhand. Which sounds exactly like him, doesn't it? The man measured his own coffee. I panicked. I told Marcus. Even Wolfe, who rarely shows surprise, let a beat pass before he spoke. You told Kepler that Ashe intended to physically inspect the stairwell and confirm its connection to the vault. I told him that same week. I thought, God help me, I thought I was warning a colleague about exposure. That's how I let myself frame it. I didn't think, I never imagined. Blythe's composure broke properly then, his voice cracking on the next words. I was in the gallery that night, yes. I've lied about the time because I was there, on the mezzanine, at the hour you said, but I was there because I'd gone up to see for myself whether the stairwell door was locked, whether Julian had already been through, and I found the mezzanine empty and the stairwell door standing open, and I panicked and left without going down, and I have told myself every night since that I don't know what that means, and I have stopped believing myself. Wolfe let the silence sit a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual dryness in it. You told one man that a careful, persistent investigator intended to walk, alone, into a place that man had personal cause to fear being discovered. That is not murder, Mr. Blythe, but it is not nothing, and I think you have known that since the moment you found the stairwell door open and your colleague's body was found the next morning 2 floors below it. Blythe didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face had already answered for him, and it wasn't the face of an innocent man relieved to have unburdened himself. It was the face of a man who had just heard, from someone else's mouth, the shape of the thing he'd been unable to say to his own reflection for 3 days. I will want you again, I think, before this is finished. But not today. When the door had shut behind him, Wolfe sat a long while without speaking, and I didn't push him, because I could see the last pieces settling into their places behind his eyes, and interrupting that particular silence has never once in my experience sped it along. Archie, he said at last, call Mrs. Voss. Tell her I want everyone in this office tomorrow evening at 9. Blythe, Nolt, Feld, Kepler, herself. Tell her it concerns the resolution of the matter, and tell her nothing further, because I think by tomorrow evening I will finally know which of 2 frightened men put his hand on a careful man's shoulder, and which merely told him where to find it. Wolfe likes his gatherings arranged just so, and by 9 the next evening the office looked the part. Voss in the red chair for once, instead of the visitor's seat, since Wolfe had her sit near his desk as a kind of silent ally. Nolte, Blythe and Feld in a row of yellow chairs, and Kepler in the chair nearest the door, with a lawyer beside him. A narrow gray man named Ferris could spend the last 20 minutes advising his client. In a whisper I could hear fine from my desk, to say absolutely nothing. Wolfe let the room settle, rang for beer, and didn't touch it, which told me he intended to talk longer than he usually likes to, before a first sip. I am going to tell you, he said, how Julian Ash died, and I am going to tell you who caused it, and I ask that no one interrupt me until I finished, because the shape of the whole matters more than any single piece of it, and I dislike having a structure I've built with care knocked down by an impatient question in the middle. Nobody interrupted. Ferris looked like he wanted to, on principle, but didn't. 8 years ago, Wolfe began, the museum purchased a Dutch interior painting through a European dealer. The purchase price recorded in the museum's books did not match the price actually paid, a discrepancy that benefits only the man positioned to profit from the difference, and countersigned, as we've established, by Mr. Kepler, then an assistant financial officer with authority sufficient to arrange such a thing, but not yet sufficient to feel entirely safe doing so. 2 years later, a valuation nearly triple the recorded purchase price was filed by a young researcher, Miss Feld, acting under instruction she was too inexperienced to question. That inflated valuation served a purpose. It obscured the original discrepancy by making the low recorded price appear, in hindsight, merely the fortunate early purchase of an underappreciated work, rather than what it actually was, a figure quietly reduced so that the difference could go, by whatever arrangement Mr. Kepler made with his dealer, into a pocket that wasn't the museum's. Kepler's lawyer put a hand briefly on his client's arm. Kepler didn't move. Separately, Wolfe went on, and unconnected to that fraud except by geography, Mr. Blythe discovered, during a mezzanine renovation 7 years ago, a painting he believed misattributed, and potentially far more valuable than catalogued. He kept, illicitly, a key to a rear service entrance of the storage vault, the entrance built during that same renovation, so that he might study the piece privately before deciding what to do about it. He never did decide, in 7 years, which tells you something about the comfort of unexamined possibilities. But that is a smaller sin than the one that brought us here tonight, and I won't dwell on it further than I already have. Mr. Kepler, Wolfe continued, discovered the missing key during a budget reconciliation, learned Mr. Blythe's reason for taking it, and rather than reporting the matter, buried it, filing a phantom hardware charge to balance the books. I believe now that his motive for this generosity was not collegial discretion, as Mr. Blythe assumed, but self-interest of a more direct kind. A rear entrance to the vault, unlogged, unwitnessed, accessible without Mrs. Voss's knowledge or a second signature, was of considerable value to a man who had already once moved money through that vault's inventory, and might reasonably expect to need such access again. I believe Mr. Kepler had a copy of that key cut for himself at the same time, using the very hardware charge he filed as cover for the expense. That's speculation, Ferris said, unable to hold his tongue any longer. You've offered no proof of a second key. I have, Wolfe said, without heat. Julian Ash's pocket, the morning he was found, contained his humidity meter, as one would expect of him, and also a torn corner of a receipt, filed among his personal effects by the police as irrelevant, since they had no fraud to connect it to and were satisfied with an accident. That receipt fragment carries a locksmith's stamp. Archie traced the locksmith Wednesday last from an address partially legible on the fragment, and the shop's own duplicate records, kept as such shops keep them, show a key blank cut and paid for in cash 7 years ago by a client giving the name N. Kepler, for a lock the shop's records describe, by manufacturer code, as matching precisely the vault's rear service door. The room had gone very still. Feld's hand had found Nolt's sleeve without either of them seeming to notice. Voss sat with her folded hands pressed white at the knuckles. Julian Ashe, Wolfe said, being the careful man everyone describes, did not accuse anyone on the strength of old records alone. He traced the fraud through Miss Nolt's provenance work and Miss Feld's valuation, and he traced the key through whatever inquiry led him to that locksmith's shop. And he arrived, I believe, at Mr. Kepler's name before he ever climbed that mezzanine stairwell. He went up that night not merely to test whether the stairwell connected to the vault, as he told Mr. Blythe he intended, but because he had already learned enough to know precisely whose key he was chasing, and he wished, being thorough, to confirm it with his own eyes before he brought the whole matter to Mrs. Voss. He never got the chance, Wolfe said, and now his voice had dropped, the way it does when he's closing a distance rather than widening one. Mr. Blythe told Mr. Kepler, out of misplaced collegial fear, that Ashe intended to inspect the stairwell that week. Mr. Kepler, already aware from his own sources, perhaps from Miss Feld's evident anxiety, perhaps from his own instincts, that Ashe was closing in on the original fraud as well, understood that discovery of both threads together would end considerably more than his career. He signed out of the building at 9:52, as the desk log shows, which he intended as an alibi, and very nearly succeeded in making one. He then re-entered through the rear vault door, using the key he'd never surrendered, and waited, or encountered Ashe by chance on the mezzanine, where the two men had, I believe, a conversation neither survived unchanged. Ashe, holding proof, would not have been silenced by argument. Mr. Kepler, cornered by a careful man he could neither bribe nor out-talk, made a decision in a moment of panic that a man with more time to think might not have made, and put his hand where a railing should have been enough protection, and wasn't. Kepler had gone the color of old paper. When he spoke, it wasn't to deny it. It was smaller than that, and worse, a man's voice, with nothing left to defend. He had it in his hand, Kepler said, the receipt. He held it up like evidence in a courtroom already, like he'd already convicted me and just wanted my face when he said it out loud. I didn't plan anything. I swear before God I didn't plan it. I went back for the receipt itself, to take it before he could show it to Eleanor. And he wouldn't give it up, and we were close to the rail, and I don't even fully remember deciding. Marcus, Ferris said sharply, stop talking. But it was 7 years too late for that particular instruction to do any good. And Kepler had already stopped on his own, staring at his hands, like they belonged to somebody he was only now meeting. Nobody in the room said anything for a while after that. Voss had her face in her hands. Blythe looked like a man watching, at last, the full weight of a small cowardice land somewhere he hadn't intended it to. I called it into Kramer myself, since Wolfe doesn't care for the telephone in moments like these. And by the time the blue and whites pulled up outside the brownstone, the fight had gone out of Kepler entirely, and he went with them the way a man goes into weather he's known was coming for days. Wolfe finally drank his beer, once the house was quiet again, and said in the tone of a man closing a ledger rather than a case, "A careful man was killed by a frightened one, over a fraud 8 years stale, and the tragedy of it, Archie, is that Mr. Kepler had every opportunity, at any point in those 8 years, simply to confess, and lose a career instead of everything. Fear is a poor accountant. It always undercounts the cost of the smaller mistake, and overcounts the cost of the truth." "You want that written down for the file?" I asked. "Or was that just for me?" "Neither," Wolfe said, and picked his book back up, which meant as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed, and dinner was overdue. "Tell Fritz we'll have the sturgeon after all. I find I've earned it." I did, and we did, and somewhere in a downtown precinct, a locksmith's receipt was doing more honest work than it had ever expected to do, closing a door that a careful man had spent his last evening trying, with his own 2 hands, to open.